My son and my daughter-in-law were plotting my ruin. But a phone call from my lawyer changed everything forever. For decades, I dedicated my life to my family. I worked tirelessly, raised my son with all love and sacrifice, and dreamed of growing old in peace in the home I built with my own hands. But when old age arrived, I did not find a welcome. I found silence, distance, and something even more painful. It was at the moment when everything seemed lost, when I no longer knew who to trust, that a simple phone call changed the course of my history. From then on, I needed to gather strength I did not even know I still had. I faced fears, broke silences, and rediscovered who I really was. Today, I am no longer the woman who lived waiting for affection. I became the woman who demands respect. I am very happy to have you here with me. Follow my story to the end. And tell me in the comments which city you are following me from. I want to know how far my voice has reached. I woke up with a good anxiety. It had been weeks since Andrew invited me for anything, and that invitation for lunch reignited a spark of hope. I chose a light blue dress, the same one I wore on his 65th birthday, when there was still affection in his eyes. While applying a light lipstick, I looked at my reflection and tried to imagine what I would say. Did he regret it? Had Lindsay backed off? My heart beat like that of a young woman in love. The bag was already hanging on my shoulder when the cell phone vibrated on the living room table. An SMS, short and direct. Call me urgent. Do not go. It was James Carter, my lawyer, always serene, always respectful. I froze. I looked at the clock. There was half an hour left until lunch. Something inside me broke in that instant. Happiness withered like a flower cut from the root. My hands trembled as I dialed the number. The call took a while to connect, as if destiny were giving me time to run away. James answered on the first ring, with a voice loaded with tension. Martha, please trust me. Do not go to the meeting with Andrew. I discovered something very serious about the apartment. My heart refused to accept it. What did he mean by serious? It was a lunch, just a lunch. It could not be more than that. I closed the door with the key still in my hand, feeling the weight of the world on my back. I just wanted to see my son. I wanted to believe that time could heal the wounds. But now, whatever it was, it called me back to reality. In that instant, the ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. I arrived at James's office even before he did. I sat in the leather chair, trying to contain my rapid breathing. When he entered, he did not smile as usual. He carried a black folder and had the reddish eyes of someone who had spent the night awake. Martha, I do not usually be an alarmist, you know. But this is serious. His words made my spine freeze. He sat in front of me, opened the folder, and took out copies of documents that seemed familiar, but at the same time strange. Do you remember when Andrew asked for your signature for a supposed update of the house insurance contract? I remembered vaguely. I was exhausted that day, and he seemed so sure of himself. James paused before completing. It was not about insurance. It was a total transfer of ownership. My mouth went dry. What do you mean transfer? He pointed to the paper. You transferred everything to him. The apartment has been in Andrew's name since April. My mind refused to accept it. I read, but I did not comprehend. It was as if I were floating outside my body. James said they tried to hide this as much as possible. But something in the registry caught his attention. They wanted to take you out of the house through the front door, with a smile on their face. But you were already out, Martha. They just did not know how to tell you. I remained silent, paralyzed. The documents did not lie. Everything I built was in their hands. James never spoke like that. Something was really wrong. I held the papers with trembling hands, trying to find a clause, a comma, anything that denied that cruel reality. But there it all was. Signature, registry in the notary office, dates, stamps. James pointed out technical details, but my mind could only repeat. I signed. I signed it myself. I felt shame, anger, sadness, a suffocating mixture. He explained that, in addition to the transfer, there was a recent mortgage placed by Andrew, probably to finance something, or to guarantee a loan. But now, Martha, legally, this apartment is no longer yours. My body gave way in the chair. The room seemed to spin. The thin air prevented me from thinking clearly. How did I not notice? James placed his hand over mine, in a gesture of humanity that made me cry. They planned everything, Martha. And today's lunch was just one more step. Maybe to keep you out of the house long enough. The reality came like a punch to the stomach. That was not carelessness, it was a plan. Plan with my name. You need to leave the house now. Temporarily. Before they advance another step. His words echoed like orders. I took my bag, the copies, the dignity I had left, and walked out without looking back. I was homeless and did not even know it. That lunch was not a reconciliation. It was a pretext to get me out of the house. Sitting on the park bench, I looked at the horizon trying to understand how everything collapsed so fast. The 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn was not just a property. It was the home I built with the profit from my confectionery, Sweet Martha. Every inch of it was paid for with hours on my feet, burns, deliveries in the rain. I remembered when Andrew was small and drew on the walls, when I planted my first violet on the balcony. Every object, every piece of furniture held a memory. The china cabinet where I kept the wedding plates. The rocking chair inherited from my mother. The kitchen where I invented recipes and dreamed of a peaceful old age. That was my anchor in the world. And now they had ripped that away from me without warning, without guilt. Just paperwork and coldness. James observed me in silence. He knew there was no immediate consolation. They are not just taking your house, Martha. They are erasing your history. And that was the most unbearable pain. The feeling of being discarded. As if all the years of dedication were just a hindrance to their plans. I was the nuisance. The old woman who needed to get out of the way. I stared at James with watery eyes. They used me. He nodded. But there was more. They are not just taking my house, they are erasing my history. Back at the office, James handed me another envelope. In it were printed conversations between Lindsay and Andrew, obtained through legal access. I trembled just seeing their names at the top of the page. I read one, then another and another. My stomach turned. She is the docile old woman. She does not react to anything. It is just about getting the final signature and then the nursing home. I have contacts. It was like reading my own social obituary. The messages detailed how they convinced me little by little, how they created false moments of affection to distract me. Pretend you are getting closer. She loves that. And more plans to put my name on a waiting list for a public shelter, to minimize costs. Lindsay spoke as if I were an old piece of furniture to be discarded. Andrew just agreed, in silence or with emojis. My fingers crumpled the paper. That was more than cruelty. It was perversity disguised as rationality. It is the best for her, Lindsay said. And Andrew? Not a word in my defense. Nothing. I was just a piece on the board. Replaceable. Unwanted. I felt nausea. James asked for calm, but there was no way. Every word was a stab. The pain invaded me with force. How could I trust so much? How did I not see the signs? The anger grew inside, but it was suffocated by a feeling even worse, shame. Shame for having deluded myself, for having raised a son who today treated me like a burden. I got up from the chair and walked in circles, not knowing what to do with so much powerlessness. James approached carefully. What they did is called financial abuse. And you are not alone. Those words stopped me. Violence? I always thought violence had another face, another form. But yes, that was a form of abuse, disguised as care, filled with sweet words and false intentions. I looked at him with eyes full of tears and a choked voice. Is there a way to fight? James took a deep breath, put his hands in his pockets and answered, yes, but it will not be easy. Are you ready? I did not answer immediately. I closed my eyes and thought of my mother who always said, when they push you to the ground, get up as if you were going to dance. I opened my eyes. For the first time I did not feel weak. I felt betrayed, yes, but also awake. Yes, but it will not be easy. Are you ready? For the first time I thought, maybe I do not need to accept everything silently. It took me 2 days to gather courage. I kept ruminating on the messages, the documents, the memories, until on a gray afternoon, I looked out the window and said out loud, enough. I was no longer going to be the woman everyone steps on, the submissive mother who accepts everything in the name of love. I called James and said I was ready. On the other end of the line, he answered firmly, then let us turn the game around. He suggested that we accept a new meeting, preferably a lunch, where I would simulate resignation. The idea was simple but risky. Record the entire conversation with a hidden microphone. If they say something compromising, we have concrete proof. I spent the next night training with James on how to conduct the conversation, how to provoke without seeming offensive, how to keep a docile tone even while hearing absurdities. It was humiliating to simulate a surrender, but every rehearsal gave me more strength. We were setting a trap with their own words. James got the audio equipment and a fake brooch that hid the microphone. In the mirror, I tested the most naive smile I could manage. Inside, I was a battlefield. Outside, a hopeful mother. Exactly as they expected. On the morning of the lunch, I took a deep breath before leaving. I looked at my house with a mixture of pain and anger. That would perhaps be the last time I would pretend for them. But this time for a just cause. This time, the ones who would eat in silence would be them. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. I ordered tea and waited. Andrew and Lindsay entered punctually, like two cold executives going to close a contract. They hugged me theatrically, complimented my look, asked about my health. I smiled, agreed, pretended. It was a play, and I needed to sustain my role until the end. We sat down, and soon the insinuations began. Lindsay brought up the subject with the lightness of someone talking about the weather. You know, Martha, the property is already included in our patrimonial planning. We need to consider the future. And your well-being. Andrew looked at his plate without meeting my eyes. Maybe it is time to think of a more adapted place. You need care. And space. I swallowed hard, disguised it with a sip of tea. With every sentence, my desire was to get up and scream. But I maintained my serenity. Lindsay went further. With all due respect, you are an unproductive liability within what is already capitalized. That hurt like a punch. But I recorded it. I recorded everything. From the feigned compliments to the moment they spoke of relocating me, with state support. Every second, every word. At the end of lunch, Lindsay suggested we schedule a new meeting with the notary. Just to formalize, understand? I agreed, still smiling. But inside I knew. I had a powerful weapon in my hands. I left there without signing anything. But with 2 hours of recording. Back at the office, James listened to everything with wide eyes. It is more than enough. He sent the audio immediately to David Miller, a civil lawyer, and to the prosecutor's office. In less than 24 hours, we received a response. Nancy Rodriguez, a prosecutor specializing in crimes against the elderly, had taken the case. It is inadmissible. We have the basis for a complete action, she declared. The meeting with Nancy was firm and objective. She did not treat it as a family drama, but as what it really was, a crime. She spoke of psychological abuse, financial abuse, and premeditation. We are going to catch them at the next attempt to formalize any transfer. With the recording, plus the mortgage documents and the alert SMS, we have enough for a precautionary measure. It was then that we defined the plan. We would schedule a meeting at the notary office, where I would supposedly sign my formal renunciation of possession. But, in parallel, the prosecutor's office would file the urgent measure freezing the property, preventing any movement. At the right moment, Agent Green would execute the order in front of them. It was surreal to think that all this was happening to me. But for the first time I felt active. Fighting. No longer a victim, but a protagonist. The hunt was set. And the trap prepared. Now it was about waiting for the exact moment to pull the trigger. I waited 2 days before calling Andrew. I made my voice sound hesitant, almost resigned. Andrew, I thought it over. Maybe you too are right. I think it is really time to move. He sighed with relief on the other end of the line. He asked if I wanted help with the move. I answered that I only wanted a small pension, to maintain my dignity. He hesitated, then said he would talk to Lindsay. In less than 2 hours, Lindsay called me. She was excited. We can resolve this quickly. How about Friday at the notary on 5th Avenue? I will bring the notary public. I agreed. She seemed too satisfied. And that was when I was sure they believed it. They thought they had one. That I yielded. That I was ready to leave quietly, submissive as always. As soon as I hung up, I sent the screenshot of the conversation to James. He replied in seconds, "It is time." The last act was in motion. They would go to the notary with a document ready, certain that I would give up everything. But they did not know that, this time, they were not dealing with the docile old woman. They were dealing with the woman they created, but now awake. I sat on the sofa and took a deep breath. I felt fear, yes, but also courage. A type of courage that is born from pain and grows with injustice. They believed it. And that was the greatest victory. The day before the meeting, I went to James's office for the last meeting. Nancy and David were already there, with the paperwork ready. The judge responsible had approved the precautionary measure. The property was frozen until further judicial order. Nothing could be transferred, sold, or mortgaged. Legally, I was still the owner. Agent Green from the public prosecutor's office was ready to execute the action. The strategy was clear. I would enter the notary office with the two of them, as if I were about to sign the waiver. When the notary began reading, James would give the signal. At that moment, the prosecutor would enter with the officer, presenting the order. Everything recorded. Everything documented. David reinforced. You need to keep calm until the last second. Any hasty reaction can ruin everything. I nodded. I was nervous but determined. Nancy looked me in the eyes and said, "Today you are not alone. We are with you." For the first time in weeks I felt safe. As if finally someone was fighting for me. That night I slept little. But I dreamed of my mother. She said, "Do not lower your eyes, Martha. Lift your chin and go." No movement could fail. The notary office was too silent. I entered with Andrew and Lindsay by my side. They feigned joy, asked if I wanted coffee. "It will be quick. Just a signature and everything is resolved." I sat before the notary, who began reading the document. Every word was a death sentence for my history, but I kept my face serene. James entered the room, followed by Nancy, David, and Agent Green. "Sorry for the interruption." Court order in hand. The notary stopped, confused. Lindsay stood up, protesting. "This is absurd." But Green bypassed her, presenting the warrant. Andrew turned pale. He looked at me, open-mouthed. "Mom." I stared at him. Silent. Firm. Nancy handed the recording to the officer, along with the screenshots and the manipulated documents. Financial abuse, attempted fraud, and emotional coercion. The notary turned off the microphone. Everything stopped. Lindsay tried to grab the papers from the table. Green stopped her with a firm gesture. David just murmured, "Everything is filmed." And it really was. Every step. I stood up calmly. I gathered my bag. I looked one last time at that scenario of deception and shame. Everything was being filmed. On the way out, I looked into his eyes and said, "Today I defended myself." The courtroom was cold, formal, silent. I sat on the reserved bench with James to the left and Nancy to the right. The judge, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, opened the session with a calm tone. Nancy was the first to speak. Her voice was firm, without hesitation. She presented the documents, the screenshots, and finally the recording. The technical expert confirmed the authenticity of the audio. He explained how the conversation was recorded without cuts, in a controlled environment. He said the language used by Lindsay was manipulative, strategic, and that Andrew, even in silence, consented. The judge listened with attention, and at some moments furrowed his brow. Nancy finished with a phrase that gave me chills. This woman was betrayed inside her own home. Not by strangers, but by those she raised. For a second, I felt I was no longer invisible. That my pain had a voice, a name, and now consequence. The judge paused briefly before proceeding. I looked at the ceiling, seeking breath. I had waited so long for that moment. And it had finally arrived. The prosecutor was not there out of pity. She was there for justice. Andrew was called to the front. He was haggard, pale. He avoided looking at me. When he began to speak, his voice was low. He said he felt ashamed, that everything had gotten out of control. He claimed that Lindsay's messages were exaggerations of language, and that he never wanted to truly harm me. The judge asked directly, "Do you believe your mother understood what she was signing?" Andrew hesitated. "She trusted me." The answer said everything. The judge then looked at me. "Mrs. Martha, do you wish for family reconciliation?" My body froze. There was no simple answer to that. I took a few seconds but said nothing. I just stared at him. Not with anger but with pain. A pain that no longer asked for justice because that, I knew, would come. But a pain that lamented what could not be rebuilt. Sometimes silence is more eloquent than any speech. James squeezed my hand, respecting my gesture. I did not need to explain myself. My heart was still a mother's heart. But my soul, no. The sentence came after 2 days. The judge, in his speech, recognized the emotional manipulation, the hidden intention behind the transfer, and the cruel omission. He declared the transfer of property null and void. The property was officially returned to me. Not just the possession but the full title without loopholes. Furthermore, he determined that the active mortgage on the property be transferred to Andrew and Lindsay's name. And in a rare gesture, he imposed a fine of $200,000 on the couple for moral and financial damage. Justice is slow, but today it did not fail, said the judge upon closing. It was the first time I cried in public without shame. James hugged me. Nancy smiled with her eyes. David congratulated me discreetly. But I only thought of the house, of the walls that welcomed me, of the floor that supported my steps, and of the woman who was now being reborn there. Amidst the emotional rubble, I took a deep breath and let a tear of relief fall. I got my house back, but I lost my son. Returning home was like entering a sacred place after an earthquake. Everything was in place. The sofa Andrew assembled at 17, the curtain I sewed with my sister, the picture frame with the old photos. But nothing was the same. The air was different. Time seemed to have passed in a skewed way. The memories, once sweet, now tasted like ash. I ran my fingers along the walls, trying to feel life in them, but they were cold, silent. I sat on the bed, the same one for so many years, and rested my head on the pillow. The silence was deafening. A victory without a party. A return without applause. But it was my space. And it had been defended. The next day I washed the floor with my own hands. Not because of dirt but for ritual. It was like erasing the tracks of pain, marking territory again. I put my books back on the shelf, repositioned the paintings, opened all the windows. The sunlight entered with force. But even so, something hurt deep down. The pain of betrayal still lived there. And maybe it would live there for a while. Victory has a bitter taste when it comes from one's own blood. The following afternoon, Clara arrived with a bouquet of daisies and an apple cake. She sat at the kitchen table without asking for permission, as she always did. She looked around and blurted out, "The house is the same. But you know." I smiled with sadness. She took me by the hand and said, "You saved your soul. That is worth more than any rotten family." It hurt to hear that, as I still loved Andrew. I still remembered the boy who cried when he hurt his knee. But Clara was right. Love cannot be an excuse to accept the unacceptable. You are not alone. And you never will be again, she said. Her words kept echoing after she left. I stood looking at the door for a while. Then I went back to the living room and sat on the floor. I took an old box with letters, notes, photos. I rummaged through my history with him, trying to find where everything got lost. But the answer was not there. It was in what he became, and in what I refused to see for so long. I wiped the tears with my wrist, and got back up. It hurt to hear, but it was true. A week later a letter arrived. The envelope bore only my name, written in the handwriting I would recognize anywhere. It was from Andrew. My hands trembled as I opened it. The text began with "Mom," and that was enough to make me cry. He asked for forgiveness. He said he got lost, that he was weak, influenced, that he did not want to see me as an enemy. He spoke of the emptiness he felt, of the shame, of the fear of never seeing me again. He asked if one day we could talk. He did not justify. He just assumed responsibility. I was worse than I imagined. But I am still your son. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in a new envelope. But I did not answer. Not yet. Because there were too many wounds. Too many silences between us. James called me the same day. He said he understood my silence. You are in no hurry. Heal in your own time. I thanked him and hung up. I stood looking out the window, remembering when Andrew ran down the hallway with toys in his hands. It was all so distant now, so broken, so confused. I did not know what I would do later, but for now silence was enough. Sometimes silence is the only medicine. Forgive. One day. Forget never. I entered the prosecutor's office with a purpose I never imagined having. Nancy received me with a warm hug and attentive eyes. I sat in front of her and took a deep breath before starting. I want to create something. A project. For women like me. For the elderly who do not know they are being robbed inside their own homes. Nancy listened in silence, and when I finished, her eyes were watery. She stood up and took my hand. Do you know how many cases like yours do not reach here? I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. Well, now they will reach here. And we are going to make noise, Martha. She promised institutional support, rooms for meetings, legal guidance, and even press assistance. I felt alive again. In the following days, I dove into the idea with an energy I did not even know I still had. I wrote, sketched, planned. I gave the project a name. Voices of Silence. That was what we were after all. Screams stifled inside closed homes. Nancy coordinated with other prosecutors, and the first meeting was scheduled. I returned home that night with a certainty in my chest. My pain would not be in vain. From this pain an army can be born. The first meeting happened in a simple hall of the community center. I arrived early with homemade cookies and a folder full of notes. Gradually, women began to arrive, each one with a tired but curious look. We sat in a circle. I was the first to speak, telling my story, not as a victim but as a survivor. One by one they began to open up. A 74-year-old lady who signed powers of attorney without knowing. Another who lost her house to her granddaughter. One who was convinced to sell everything and now lived in a borrowed room. The stories were different in details, but identical in essence. Betrayal by those they loved most. We stayed there for hours. We laughed, we cried, we listened to each other. For the first time since everything, I felt that my suffering had a purpose that went beyond me. It was not just my pain, it was that of many. And now, together, we were creating a new language, that of resistance. Of awareness. Of protection. When I left the center, the sky was grayish, but I felt illuminated. My scars became a compass for others. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was Andrew. I answered with my heart racing. He asked to talk in person. He said he did not want to erase anything, but needed to talk. We met on the park bench where we used to have snacks on Sundays. He arrived with slow steps and eyes down. I sat first. He came later. The conversation began with silences. Many, then cautious words. I was weak, a coward, and I let myself be led. I spoke little. I just listened. I asked what he expected now. Nothing. Just that you listen to me. That is all. There was a tone of respect there. For the first time he seemed to see the woman in front of him, not just the mother. I said there was no return, but maybe there was a new path. Not the same. Not innocent. But possible. He nodded, saying he understood. I want to deserve this maybe. One day. Those words touched me but did not disarm me. It was still early. But it was also the beginning of something. We walked side by side in silence. And in that silence there was something different. Nothing will be as it was before. But maybe something new can be born. For the first time we spoke without masks. Returning to the community center as a speaker was one of those moments that life seems to give back. I set up a small sweets workshop, and between one recipe and another, I spoke about the rights of the elderly, legal traps, emotional abuse. I saw in the eyes of those women something I had not seen in myself for months. Hope. They asked me about strategies, laws, reactions. I answered firmly but also with empathy. There was no magic formula, but there was strength. I showed how to identify signs, the importance of speaking up, of asking for help. While stirring the sugar syrup on the community stove, I felt that my life was changing again. After the workshop, a young woman approached and said, "My grandmother lived something similar. Can I bring her next time?" I nodded with a light heart. There, in that simple space, I felt that something was healing in me. Every shared word was a drop of medicine. Every recipe, a ritual of transformation. I returned home with the smell of vanilla on my clothes, and with a new perfume in my soul. I transformed despair into sweetness. A few weeks later, Nancy called me for an event in Manhattan. It was a recognition ceremony for initiatives supporting the elderly. I thought I would just watch. But I was called to the stage. I received an honorable mention for the project Voices of Silence. The microphone trembled in my hands, but my voice did not. I spoke about my history, about how justice cannot be the privilege of those who scream the loudest, but rather the support for those who can almost no longer speak. When I finished, the audience stood up. Among the faces, I saw James applauding with pride, Nancy emotional, Clara with shining eyes and a broad smile. After the event, a reporter asked me for an interview. How would you define this new phase of your life? I thought for a second and answered, as the awakening of someone who refused to disappear. The phrase echoed on social media in the following days, and I received dozens of letters from people thanking me for saying what they could never manage to say. I never felt like a celebrity, but on that day I felt that I existed, that my pain was not ignored. Once invisible, now an inspiration. The next morning, a dry knock on the door made me freeze. I opened it slowly and found Lindsay on the other side. Impeccable as always, cold as always. I came to talk about the agreement, she said, without beating around the bush. I let her enter. She sat without being invited. She said she wanted to resolve it with dignity. She spoke of values, of time, of reputation. I just listened, without interrupting, without lowering my eyes. When she finished, I took a deep breath and said calmly, "You have no more power over me." She laughed nervously, but she did not answer. She got up and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned to me. "You really changed, huh?" I just smiled. I closed the door without looking back. The visit left me restless for a while, but it soon passed, because for the first time I was not afraid of her. Neither of her words nor her presence. I no longer carried guilt or doubt. She could no longer hurt me, and her silence upon leaving was the greatest proof of that. She left quiet. For the first time, the park bench was the same as before. The tree behind, the lake in front, the leaves fallen on the autumn ground. Andrew arrived with hesitant steps. He wore simple clothes, more sober. He sat beside me and for a while neither of us spoke. Then he began to tell. He was in therapy. He got a new job far from the financial sector. He said he did not seek forgiveness, just a chance to show me who he was now. He spoke with a serene tone, without self-pity, just naked truths. I listened to everything, without interrupting, without dramatizing. When he finished, I turned my face and said, looking into his eyes, "I love you, but I do not trust you." He swallowed hard but did not argue. He just nodded, accepting. There was no more room for manipulations. I made it clear, we would not be as before, but maybe with time we would find another form of coexistence. One with boundaries, with space, with truths. We stood up together. We walked in silence. And in that silence, for the first time, there was maturity. "I love you, but I do not trust you." I spoke with Clara that night. I needed to hear someone who knew my before and after. She arrived with a jar of jam and sat on the sofa like someone who already knew. I told her about the meeting with Andrew. Every word, every pause. She listened with a firm gaze and without interruptions. When I finished, she said, "Love and boundaries can walk together. What you feel does not diminish you, humanizes you, but it does not oblige you to start over from the same place." Her words embraced me from the inside. I still loved Andrew, but I no longer needed to annul myself to fit into that love. And that made all the difference. I decided I would keep in contact with him, yes, but without illusions, without expectations, without giving up my peace. If he wanted to build something new, he would have to come by the path of respect, by the way of truth, and I would only follow as far as my dignity allowed. Clara smiled and said, "This is the Martha who was always there, waiting to be heard. I am no longer that needy woman." On Mother's Day Sunday, the intercom rang early. A delivery man came up with a bouquet of white lilies. On the card only, "For the woman who taught me everything. With affection, Andrew." I sat at the kitchen table, looked at the flowers for a few minutes. I did not cry. I just smiled. It was a gesture. Not a cure, but a gesture. And on that day it was enough. I put the flowers in an old vase of my mother's and left them in the living room. It was beautiful to see something bloom, even if timidly after so much pain. I took a deep breath, drank my coffee calmly, and turned on the radio. The music playing was old, the kind that cradles good and sad memories at the same time. And I let it play. Because it was no longer the past that defined me. It was what I did with it now. The morning continued serenely. I allowed myself to live that peace without fear. Maybe it is the beginning of a new phase. A phase where I come first. The auditorium was full. Women with white hair, with walkers, with looks marked by life. Men too. Attentive young people. I was called to the stage and walked with firm steps. I took the microphone with calm hands. I took a deep breath. And I spoke. Not as a victim, but as a symbol of something greater. I spoke about dignity. About how age does not diminish anyone's value. About betrayals inside the home where love should protect. I cited data, stories, names. But what caught the attention most was when I said, I was betrayed, but not destroyed. And no one else needs to be. I saw watery eyes, trembling smiles, hands squeezed between strangers. At the end, they gave a standing ovation. And for the first time, I felt that my voice carried others. Voices silenced for decades. Voices that now wanted to be heard. After the event came hugs, letters, photos. A woman said, You spoke what I could never manage to say even to my daughter. I left there with a light heart. That night, I wrote in my diary, I am not an exception. I am a warning. I am not an exception. I am a warning. Reopening the confectionery for a day was Clara's idea. Just to close this cycle with sugar, she said. And it was exactly that. I spent the morning preparing pies, cakes, brigadeiros. I received old customers, neighbors, women from the project. I hugged each one as if the touch could seal a story. I put old songs on the record player, used the apron my mother sewed, and let the smell of vanilla take over the environment. The children who entered got free cookies. The adults a smile and a word of strength. It was more than a day of sales. It was a rite of passage. When the last batches came out, I sat near the counter and observed. I saw my past, my effort, my essence. Everything there alive, strong, full of meaning. And then I closed the doors. Not with sadness, but with plenitude. I left the keys with the new tenant. A young confectioner starting to dream. I closed the doors of the confectionery and opened others inside me. Here begins my new recipe for life. The following week, I sat on the veranda with paper and pen. I wrote a letter. Not to Andrew, but to all the women who one day felt too small, too weak, too guilty. I wrote that it is no shame to have loved those who hurt us, but that it is courage to stop accepting it. I wrote that age is not a prison, that love is not an excuse, and that justice is not a favor, it is a right. I told my story in a few lines but with all my soul. I said that living with dignity is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and that no one should grow old afraid of those they raised. I signed with my first and last name, without shame, without disguise. That letter was not just a farewell. It was also a seed. I sent it to local newspapers, to NGOs, to social media. I wanted other voices to find an echo, that other women would find their strength before losing everything. It is never too late to own your own story. This is me now. Martha. Whole. And free. Now I am curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you gone through something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I am leaving on the final screen another story that you will also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.